Welcome back into the Lions247 Podcast. We have begun game week number 9 of this 2024 Penn State football season, but we're going to spend a lot of time looking back at game number 8, which for many of us has been the defining one on this Penn State 2024 schedule and something that we'll be learning from moving forward. It was a 20-13 loss against Ohio State, extended the Buckeyes' reign over the Nittany Lions to 8 consecutive games. You heard from myself and myself and Daniel Gallen from Beaver Stadium before we said goodbye on Saturday. Spent about 40 minutes or so breaking down what we witnessed during that defeat for the Nittany Lions, some of the key frustrations involved. As we always do, we try to get as much off of our plate for that post-game podcast as possible, but we get to these Mondays and we pick things up where we left off by bringing in Mark Brennan as part of that conversation. So without further ado, fresh out of James Franklin's weekly Beaver Stadium press conference, here is Daniel Gallen and Mark Brennan joining me on the Lions247 podcast. Daniel, as I said, you and I spent a lot of time going back and forth. We're going to hear from you again in just a moment. But Mark, we have not heard from you, at least our listeners and viewers haven't, regarding what went down in Beaver Stadium on Saturday afternoon. So the microphone is yours. Penn State picks up its first loss of the season in familiar fashion.
Yeah, I'm trying to think of how to condense this because between the report card and the takes, I wrote over 3,000 words of analysis and criticism. One thing I would like to say is for the report card, I gave the defense a D, and I got some blowback on that from some of our subscribers, which I love. I mean, it's like very good feedback, people explaining why they thought it shouldn't have been a D. And I think they're probably right. I probably should have gone like C-. Just the way that they played on that final drive. Sometimes that one thing, the thing that's closest in the rearview mirror is what you're remembering the most. But I think I kind of overlooked a lot of the good things they did throughout that game. So to all the people out there who gave us good feedback, I really do appreciate that. That's what these pieces are all about. Listen, I mean, I don't know how you get to the situation you got in, first and goal from the 3, and your best player doesn't touch the ball. I mean, it reminded me of 2018 against Ohio State when you had 4th and 5 and Trace McSorley had compiled 8,000 yards in that game, and they hand off to Miles Sanders. I mean, they literally gave us a handout, a flyer on Tyler Warren, just talking up all of his accomplishments. The guy gets you to the 3-yard line, and then he doesn't touch the ball. It's inexcusable. And to his credit, James Franklin admitted as much today that your best player has to touch the ball at least once there. But the greater thing is, listen, again, you can't score 6 points on offense against Ohio State. To me, you guys know how high I am on Andy Kotelnicki. I projected he would win the Broyles Award, which obviously is not going to happen. But this moment was too big for him. It was. I mean, I'm just saying it straight out. Now, I don't know that that's necessarily a bad thing moving forward because this was his first time on that stage. And the key is for him to learn from it. And I truly believe that he will. That is not an easy thing to do. I'm not suggesting that any coordinator could go into that sort of game and push all of the right buttons. But when you look at the 2 coordinators on either side of that fight, Chip Kelly and Andy Kotelnicki, I mean, Chip Kelly got the better of it, even though they weren't going head-to-head. I mean, he was going against the defensive coordinator. But that has to be a learning experience for him. The other thing, I would get into is after the game, I really liked the way that the players handled it. They were the thing with Nick Singleton, and I mentioned this on our TV show, the press conferences seem to be winding down, and everybody was kind of clearing out, and in walks Nick Singleton. And at the very end, and he didn't have to do that, and not that he played poorly or anything, but we figured that we were done with these things. And he sat there for 10 or however many minutes, fielding one question after another. The fact that he felt it was important to come out shows me a level of accountability. We saw it from Drew Aller. We saw it from Tyler Warren. We saw it from multiple other players, but we kind of didn't think Singleton was coming out, and then he did. And I don't know why it took him so long to come out, but the fact that he did, I really like that, and I like the accountability that all the players had. So, hey, this is a situation where you're in a different era now, 12-team college football playoff. Everything is still there for you. So it's going to be how they handle things this week and then moving forward. So I know that was kind of a lot, and maybe even kind of not all that much given the magnitude of that game. But we have a lot to get to from James Franklin and everything else today. So let's roll.
Daniel and I tried to set that scene a little bit for our listeners, I think, on Saturday evening when we recorded our podcast, just how the environment in the post-game media setting was not one of shell-shocked players, which we have seen after a Michigan loss or an Ohio State loss.
Or finger pointing. No finger pointing.
There was certainly no finger pointing, and it was very much a lot of guys saying, look, we're going to play in the college football playoff. Some of them saying we want to play Ohio State in the postseason. Yep. It was a lot of forward thinking versus being prisoners of the moment. And Daniel, that was something we addressed, but a lot of us are prisoners of the moment for what went down late in this game. Everyone's been talking about it. Those 4 plays at the goal line after Tyler Warren goes Superman, gets you down to the goal line with a big run and a big catch, and then you can't convert and get those points. On the day, it was a frustrating day. 3 points off 3 red zone visits. You had twice inside the 10 where you don't get any points off of it, turnover on downs, and an interception as the first half comes to a close. But it was that goal line failure, and I'm sure in Columbus they're calling it a goal line stand, that really made the difference and stuck with a lot of people. And naturally, it was brought up directly to James Franklin today. And I think we were able to peel back some layers. And if James Franklin is telling the truth, this was Andy Kotelnicki's show down at the goal line.
Definitely. James Franklin was asked the question about the process and the mechanics of what goes into a play call, when and how he can provide his input or his influence. And he said that happens after the play call or when there's a break and he can give a suggestion, something along those lines. I did think that the reflection was pretty good by James Franklin. And I think that he offered both sides of the coin, where on the one hand, probably should have gotten the ball to Tyler Warren, probably should have maybe, on second down, tried to get him the ball, do something well. But then he also said that if you want to win in the Big Ten, you have to be able to gain a yard. And Penn State was unable to do that at the end of the game. Katron Allen got stuffed after running twice for 1 yard, got stuffed the third time for 0 yards. And then you have an incompletion from the 1 yard line. You want to win games like these, you have to be able to get a yard, especially when you're a team that's like Penn State this year that has prided itself on being physical. It's prided itself on having an offensive line that it's developed and is confident in. So it was something that stood out to me. Franklin also talked about that, that balance where it's, if you do one thing one way, people will say, why didn't you do it this way? But if you do it that way and it doesn't work, then people are going to say, well, why didn't you do it the other way? He mentioned that getting too cute down there by the goal line was probably something that if you pass 3 times and it doesn't work, that's a criticism that you get. But I think it's a sequence that is really going to stick with you as you move forward. I think that you think about the past couple of seasons in these Ohio State and Michigan games, these close games that Penn State has lost. There's been sequences and plays and things of that nature. But like Mark invoked with 2018, this feels like the first time since then that there's something so focused, so concrete, from one of these games that really, really sticks with you a couple of days later. And probably the next time these two teams play, that is something that is going to be talked about as well.
Hey, guys, was anybody suggesting they should get cute down there? I don't know where James was coming from with that. Give Tyler Warren a damn ball. Put him as a Wildcat quarterback and let him plow his 265-pound, 6'5" frame. I mean, at least try it. And this way, if it doesn't work, at least you went to your best player. Nobody wanted them to get cute. I haven't heard one single person say they should have run the Philly special. You know what I mean? Or who's even suggesting that? I think everybody was like, get your best player the ball, stick it in it, snap it straight to him and let him go ahead. So I'm not sure where James is coming from on that.
Well, I think ultimately he did state what a lot of people were feeling. You got to find a way to get the ball to Tyler Warren. He said hindsight is 20/20, but that's where it is right now. And regarding Kotelnicki, being in control of that situation. Here's what James Franklin said, quote, "There's really no discussions on a headset during a play call. The last thing you want to do with the OC is to have the head coach or somebody else interjecting in those critical moments and making that coordinator hesitate." And I know that Kotelnicki has this, aggressive mentality. He's a guy that has dialed up some really interesting play calls here. And then you go back to Kansas. We heard from a Kansas beat reporter. He said, you're going to love most of the plays, but there's going to be some games that you come out of with the play calling and you're wondering what went wrong there. And so no offensive coordinator is perfect. And now Andy Kotelnicki steps into the spotlight, really the buzzsaw of an Ohio State, Penn State matchup. And when you don't find success there, the honeymoon's over. I mean, we can put it there. The honeymoon is over with Andy Kotelnicki. I don't think people want him pushed toward the exit door by any mean, but he's kind of had this stepping stone process since last December where everything he's done has taken him up a rung of the ladder. This is not really that moment, of course, based on what happens. And I think the frustrating point here, Daniel, going back to it, is this was an afternoon where Kaytron Allen, who got those 3 carries, and Nick Singleton combined for fewer than 45 rushing yards. Tyler Warren only needed 3 carries to become the team's leading rusher. I think on that 30-plus yard run, he had more yards than Nick Singleton had on the entire day with his 6 carries. And that's part of it is we know Kaytron Allen has a history of being a physical runner, kicking down that door at the goal line. But viewing the game as it was, Tyler Warren was hot. The running backs were not. Your offensive line was struggling to get significant push. And it felt like you were banking on things coming together at the right time, and they did not.
Definitely. Something else that I saw pointed out on, I think on our message board is the play design there. We love to watch Vanga go in motion, but at the same time, when you have a yard to get, he's your biggest offensive lineman. He might be playing the best of any of their offensive linemen this year, and you take him out of that interior where you're trying to get push, you're trying to move forward. So it was something else that, a couple of days later, different things stand out to you. One of our posters highlighted that, and I thought that was pretty noteworthy as well. But I think that you just have to look. It felt almost like an attempt at underthinking it a little bit, where it's okay, we're at the 3, we're just going to run it 3 times in a row, and that'll get in. Where I think in this type of matchup, Jim Knowles did a great job, and that Ohio State defense really did step up and made a lot of big plays when it needed to get off of the field. So I think that, at some point you're going to have to go maybe off script a little bit. And that was something that it felt like Andy Kotelnicki had done a good job of so far this year, was keeping opposing teams off balance, pushing different buttons at different times to get the results that you needed. So I was surprised that they went back to that 3 times in a row. I mean, I feel like 9 times, 8 times, 7 times out of 10, if you ask Kaytron Allen to get 3 yards on 3 carries, he's probably going to do it. But I think that after that second time where you get stopped, I think that you just needed to look for something else, push that Tyler Warren button in some way, and just figure it out. Something else I thought about too, we haven't seen the T formation in a long time either. And that was also a bread and butter play or formation down near the goal line. So there are a lot of different ways that you can go with this. And I think that years from now, this is probably going to be a sequence that will continue to come up, just like 2018 with 4th and 5.
And you've also got a 6'5", 238-pound quarterback who had rushed for 3 first downs on the day. Seemed to be certainly not limited, at least as a guy moving with the ball in his hands. He was not called upon in that moment. And as we'll get to a little bit later, Bo Prabula didn't pop up, really in any crucial circumstance. We'll talk about his role in a moment. But Mark, going back to the defensive performance, as you said, maybe you were a little too hard on them coming out of the game. But James Franklin addressed it today, said he felt like overall you take on an opponent like Ohio State, you hold them to 20 points. That's probably got to be good enough. You can't really sneeze at the result there. But there were some specific drives that he felt like were below the standard that Penn State has come to set for themselves on defense. I think he mentioned 3. You could really toss in a 4th one if you don't have that fumble by Ohio State's quarterback at the goal line. But 2 long touchdown drives that put them up ahead 14-10. And then, of course, the clock milking 5-minute possession that follows that goal line stand and allows Ohio State to get out of town without ever giving the ball back to Andy Kotelnicki, Drew Aller, and company.
Yeah, I mean, you could live with the ones earlier in the game because that's not – I know people say that you can't look at one drive or whatever, but when a team has a ball at its own 1-yard line and there's 5+ minutes to go and you have 3 timeouts left, and everybody, as James said, in the stadium knew they were going to run it, you have to be able to stop them. You just do. I mean, I don't care who the team was. That stuff earlier in the game – Ohio State has good players and got, the receivers are terrific. Penn State did a good job overall against the receivers, not on every play, but they're going to make plays. But when you get to a point where you make them completely one-dimensional or they're making themselves completely one-dimensional, you have to be able to stop that. I mean, you just do. And I still, going back and looking at it, I don't know if Penn State was afraid it was going to give up something deep or what was happening there, but they just absolutely dominated at the line of scrimmage. And this is with a beat-up offensive line. I mean, those running backs, they're good, obviously. I mean, we saw Judkins, in the bowl game last year. We know how tough he is. He's a tough physical runner. But if you want to play at a championship level, you have to be able to stop a team when everybody in the entire stadium knows they're going to run it. And Penn State wasn't. And, the thing that bothered me after the game was when Franklin said, and I'm paraphrasing here, I don't remember the exact words that he used, but he kind of suggested that the defense might have been deflated because the offense didn't kind of punch it in there. That, to me, that can't happen. I mean, that's not complementary football. Complementary football is when one area struggles and the other picks it up. And we've seen that go both ways this year. We've seen, the defense maybe not play well at a certain point and the offense getting it done and vice versa. So yeah, if you want to compete for championships, you can't have your defense being worried about the offense, not punching it in or turning it over or doing whatever. This defense has been really good after turnovers and after the offense is screwed up. I mean, all year, and for it to fall apart at that point, it just goes back to that whole Ohio State narrative where it's almost as if they find ways to lose this game every year. One year it's, 2018 that we're talking about. This year it's that you can't punch it in and then the defense kind of falls apart. It's always something happening in the last 5, 6, 7, 8 minutes that Ohio State's able to pull it out. And to me, that comes down to just overall coaching and getting your players to be able to produce in the clutch. I don't know what else you could say because it's a pattern. I mean, you can't blame the players because it's happening every single year with different players.
And of course, when we brought up the notion of James Franklin taking this loss, guys like Sal Wormley were like, this is on the players too. Sure. And so there's a lot of a mirror looking happening right now. It's the way it's been described in the Lash building, and they'll be back on the practice field Tuesday. But Daniel, you and I broke this down in the postgame podcast. There have been a variety of separating factors during this 8-game losing streak to Ohio State. You can look at talent level. You can look at plays that made the difference. You can look at years when Ohio State kind of raced beyond Penn State. But you can usually say Ohio State had some big-time blue-chip guys step up and do something that really just damaged Penn State. Not necessarily the case this time around, but on the flip side, we don't often say that a Penn State wide receiver stepped up in the bright lights in a big moment. It's been a while. You probably got to go back to Jahan Dotson the last time we saw that really apparent. Certainly not the last couple of matchups against Ohio State. And when you look at the body of work for this receiver group, as we covered in the postgame podcast, 3 catches, under 50 receiving yards collectively for them. You had a moment where Harrison Wallace had a chance to bring in a touchdown potentially near the end of the half to give Penn State the lead. And one way or another, to the credit of Ohio State's defender, it ends up being a turnover, and Penn State gets nothing out of that opportunity. James Franklin was asked directly today. I thought it was a really good phrasing of the question regarding that receiver room. Are they giving Penn State enough, and can they give Penn State enough for this program to get where it wants to be in 2024? And this is no secret that wide receiver was going to be an issue or a concern or something that they needed to take a step forward to. And James Franklin has been asked about it often. What did you make of his response to that question, Daniel?
Yeah, I will say in terms of wide receivers stepping up, don't forget about Parker Washington 2 years ago. 11 catches, 179, and a touchdown in that crazy shootout
Good
at
point.
Beaver Stadium. But yeah, I mean, I think that the wide receiver, I think coming in, that was a matchup that we were watching, or not even a matchup, but a contrast to see what could Penn State get out of that group. We'd heard so much about how they had improved, what was next for them, guys stepping out, and we'd seen it too. That's the one thing where this wasn't necessarily like, oh yeah, like this is going well, this is working, we're expecting big things, that we're being told and we haven't seen it. We talked about the number of guys that had gone over 100 yards, the different guys that had big catches in different spots, throughout the first part of the schedule, and to not get anything out of that, I thought it was just a really big missed opportunity, and just kind of more of the same when over these past 2 seasons with this group. I did think that Franklin made a good point, and I thought that his analysis was pretty clear-eyed in terms of looking at what they have, and what he wants to see moving forward. He did say that he's seen the improvement both on the field, in practice, and in production, but there is just more work to do. And he said they have to be able to threaten people, they have to be able to stretch the field, they have to be able to make plays, they have to be able to create separation. And that's all things that we did not see much of on Saturday against Ohio State. I think that, it's just at this point, you really shake your head at not being able to get, much out of this group. Trey Wallace had a tough break on that interception. Things maybe look a little bit different if that's an incompletion or if he somehow hangs on to it or something along those lines. But yeah, I think that wide receiver moving forward is going to be even more under the microscope in terms of the job Marcus Higgins is doing with his development, what those players are doing, and what Drew Aller can do, with what he's been given by that group.
Yeah, you look at it, it felt very reminiscent of some of the post-game analysis that we saw in evaluation last year, where you're not seeing the separation downfield, and you're trying to put yourself in the shoes of Drew Aller, and what are you going to do in those moments, and what's down there? Where is the clear striding target? And Ohio State, I mean, you want to talk about gaining separation. There were two different deep balls they attempted that, if they're better passes, Ohio State's receivers had the separation to maybe go long distance for touchdowns. And it felt like when James Franklin said we've got to threaten people at that position, didn't that bring you right back to last fall? I mean, he talked about needing to stretch the field with his receivers, needing to intimidate defensive opponents, not get dictated to. And I think we've all acknowledged that Penn State's wide receiver group, it was different players stepping up at different times through September into October. We saw a few different 100-yard receiving games. We only saw one receiver last year do that, in Keandre Lambert-Smith. But you start to assess what has happened in 5 Big Ten conference games. And I'll give you the bullet point rundown real quick before I throw it back to you, Mark, for your commentary on this subject. But Clifford had 107 yards against UCLA. That's the only time a receiver has reached 70 yards against the Big Ten defense this season. Clifford had a 57-yard catch against UCLA. No one else has even a 30-yard game in Big Ten action at the receiver position. It's been a 4-man group. We've talked about that. It's Harrison Wallace, Liam Clifford, Julian Fleming, Omari Evans. If you're looking, well, is there someone else to step up, maybe to add something to that mix? Tyler Johnson, a redshirt sophomore, is next man up in terms of game snaps. He's got 37 total snaps in 4 game appearances. Tysier Denmark is the most promising freshman they have on campus. He has only entered 1 game against Kent State. And then you look at Harrison Wallace. He has been the steadiest of the mix. Some issues last week, but 30% of his total yardage came in the first half of the West Virginia game. That's also when he scored both of his touchdowns on the season. Julian Fleming, he has a catch in every game, but he doesn't have more than 2 catches in any game, and he only has 35 receiving yards or more once in 8 matchups. And then Omari Evans, this is one that I think really stands out right now because of the early burgeoning thoughts that we had on where the wide receiver group was going compared to the reality that we now see at the start of November. Evans, 8 catches, 205 yards, 2 touchdowns in 3 non-conference matchups. You're like, wow, there's your vertical threat. They unlock something in this offense. This is huge for Drew Aller. This is huge for Omari Evans. Well, in Big Ten play, 5 games, 3 catches, 31 yards. So, Mark, there's the bullet points. I try to give a good scope of where we're at. What are you looking at with this room moving forward?
I mean, no touchdowns in Big Ten play.
And no touchdowns in Big Ten action.
I haven't looked at it, but do you think there's any other team in the Big Ten that has 0 touchdowns from its receivers? And I don't know. Maybe Purdue. I don't know. But, I mean, I just can't believe that. I think the most troubling thing about this is what all these guys are all about now. I mean, I overestimated what Harrison Wallace was going to be. And, he hasn't emerged as the go-to guy. The difficult part is when you look at other positions, okay, you look over at defensive back, and if somebody isn't getting the job done, or even if they are getting the job done, there are young players who are forcing their way onto the field at stacked positions. You look at the offensive line, a guy like Cooper Cousins, Donko. I mean, he's a young guy. I mean, you have guys forcing their way into action. Who's doing that at wide receiver? I mean, you're tempted to ask, is there somebody else you give a shot here? A Tysier Denmark. And obviously they're just not comfortable doing it, unless Peter Gonzalez is that guy. And, he's banged up and out for the season. But that to me is kind of the troubling spot, because where do you see this getting better?
Mark, it's 3 cycles, really. I mean, you look at the freshman class now. Peter Gonzalez is sidelined. Josiah Brown's a scout team player right now. And Tysier Denmark apparently hasn't been able to break through into a rotational role. But then the cycle before, your only freshman receiver is a top 24/7 talent, but it's Carmelo Taylor, who was here on campus, and then he's gone. He's now competing at the JUCO level. And then you look around and you say, well, who else did you bring last year? Malik McClain, he's at Arizona State. Dante Cephas, he's at Kansas State. The class before that, Omari Evans has been the most productive member of a 5-man receiver class from 2022. Caden Saunders hasn't played any offense this year. He's been banged up. We haven't seen him in any action lately. Then you've got Tyler Johnson, who I said, 40 snaps across 4 games. Anthony Ivy hasn't been able to make any noise. Mekhi Flowers transitioned from cornerback to wide receiver in that class. He hasn't surfaced as an offensive talent. So to me, when you go 3 straight cycles and you don't have fruit to bear, and the last 2, you've got the receivers coach that you currently have involved, that is a red flag that is being raised when you don't have an influx. You're leaning on a 5th-year senior who started 20 games at Ohio State. No one's going to be surprised that he showed up here and was able to make a dent in your rotation. Where is the homegrown, cultivated talent? I think that's really the concerning part right now.
Especially when you're playing that opponent, right? When you look across the sideline, and every year they're bringing in a freshman who's setting the world on fire, and they're losing guys to the NFL draft and just replacing them. It's almost like the tight end position at Penn State, where, you're so good that there are really good players not playing. With Penn State's wide receiver position, I mean, it is, you hate to be critical of college players. I don't think I'm being critical, though. They kind of are who they are, right? I think to expect anything more at this point, what else? I mean, how many more opportunities are they going to get? You know what I mean? I mean, what else could they do? I mean, when you're in that game, and the digital stats are a little screwed up, and the ones that I have printed out here, excuse me. I mean, you're looking at the targets. Liam Clifford 3 targets, Fleming 1, Harrison Wallace 4. That's it. They're not even being targeted. I mean, so what happened to this getting the ball to your athletes in space? I mean, it's a real problem, and this is something that, with all due respect to everybody who's on the roster, they really need to be aggressive in the portal. I mean, as aggressive as they can possibly be to get guys who are capable of producing consistently at this level. I mean, you look at what Keandre Lambert-Smith is doing at Auburn. Auburn isn't very good, but he's leading them in receiving. He's leading them in touchdowns. I don't know that he was the answer, because he was so inconsistent at Penn State that you couldn't rely on him. So you got to get out there in the portal, and that is absolutely priority to me. Priority number 1 in that portal is getting guys who can be effective at the Big Ten level. I mean, and I'm just going to circle back to where I started. We're 5 games into the Big Ten season. And no, Bobby Ingram had 4 touchdowns in one Big Ten game. I mean, I think it was his first Big Ten game. I mean, this is what you're looking at, and it's not sustainable. One thing I will give Franklin credit for, when he's asked about this, he's got to be careful because he can't throw his own players under the bus. I mean, we could sit here and analyze it and feel bad because we're being critical of college players. But James Franklin isn't going to do that because it's not going to be productive at all. He knows what he has, and he's trying to squeeze the best out of it. These guys are playing hard. Don't get me wrong. These guys are high character guys. They're getting after it. They're doing the best they can. But you compare that to the talent at the other positions, and it's just not comparable.
John Dotson scored 3 touchdowns in 2020 against Ohio State in one game. But yeah, we have not seen it. It's unfortunate because, there was a lot of conversations with these guys over the course of the offseason into the season. And clearly they want to be able to flip that switch and be viewed as a receiving group that is a threat. But you just wonder, even if in the next 4 games we see, some positive momentum from that receiver group, maybe they score a touchdown, maybe you see a couple more 100-yard games. But what's the confidence level really going to be if they were to earn another matchup against this Ohio State team down the road? Or if they're going to go, play a big-time SEC program in the playoffs, how much are you really thinking you're going to get out of that receiver group? And I think kind of the double gut punch for that, Daniel, is it was also an afternoon where you couldn't count on those running backs. And there's been matchups where you could lean on these guys. The Illinois game's a good example earlier this year where they just were able to go to the ground and pound it out and come away with a win over a ranked opponent. But this time, as I said, less than 45 total yards combined for Nick Singleton and Kaytron Allen. Back-to-back years now where they've had 18 total carries between the two of them, and they haven't really been all that effective. A couple of years ago as freshmen, they went for 120 plus against Ohio State on the ground, which is by far the most success that any running backs have had in this series during the 8-game losing streak. But we got to address it. Nick Singleton has not rushed for 50 yards or more in the last 3 games since he came off of that injury that kept him sidelined against UCLA. We don't know what that situation is. It remains unspecified. But he's been more effective as a receiver than a rusher, it would seem, during the last few games. And then you look at Kaytron Allen over the course of this year, overall, Mr. Consistent, but in a couple of these matchups, USC 3.5 yards per carry, UCLA 3.7 yards per carry, Ohio State 2.3 yards per carry. Those aren't really Kaytron Allen numbers. And so you combine the two, you wonder what's going on with the ground game. James Franklin addressed that they need to have more success with those traditional 2 running back, with the running back rushing approach. They've had some window dressing with this rushing attack, but I think the concern here is, Daniel, if the receivers aren't going to do it for you, the running backs really need to.
Definitely. I mean, that was the one thing we talked about the last time this running game had a good game against Illinois, where people were concerned about some of Drew Aller's numbers and things like that. And it was like, well, he didn't need to do anything because those wide receivers didn't need to step up because they had the running game. That's what they were going to do. It seemed like that was going to be their identity. And they sealed off what was a ranked win at the time by doing that. And then since then, it just has not been there. Nick Singleton did tell us after the Wisconsin game that he is banged up, and he does not look like the same guy he was earlier in the season. That's something that we talked about with this position, where these past 2 years, Penn State had been very, very fortunate that they'd kept Allen and Singleton healthy for the most part. So RB3 was sort of an afterthought for 2 years. But so I just think that James Franklin said that they've had success with their heavy packages, and that's been something that has opened up some yardage for them. But at the same time, when you use that heavy package, the opposing team is allowed to match it because you're substituting, and so you kind of know what's coming, and they're just looking to get more success in that traditional, I guess, run a play, normal game flow type thing. I think he referred to it as the more spread, when they're more spread out, having more success running like that. But yeah, I mean, it's when you look back on Saturday, I mean, really nothing was working for the offense. The running backs couldn't get going. The wide receivers weren't getting open. And I think that then you saw Drew Aller really try to take things into his own hands with his legs. And you saw Tyler Warren have to make the biggest play of the game with that big run where he really took it into his own hands to get down and set them up for that goal line sequence. And so I just think with this running back group, you have to figure something out. I know that with health, that makes it a little bit difficult. But whether it's blocking, scheme, simplifying things, I don't know what the answer is, but you have to figure something out at this point.
The most effective play in the run game lately has been Tyler Warren taking the direct snap and going to work with his big frame. And you just wonder on Nick Singleton, does he have a chance to get back to form this season? Again, he's been very effective as a receiver, 6 catches, 54 yards against Ohio State. But as a runner, you look at those first 4 games before he was sidelined against UCLA, he was 6 yards plus average on carries each of those 4 games. He got to at least 81 rushing yards each week. He had a few 40-plus yard runs along the way. And then you look at the last 3 matchups since he comes back after the UCLA absence. His longest run is 18 yards. His longest run against Ohio State was 4 yards. And he's not averaged more than 4 yards per carry in any of those 3 games. And again, he's another guy who did not have the ball in his hands at the goal line. We think about how effective he was. I mean, he was back to the Nick Singleton of old earlier this season. So not any Nick Singleton and Tyler Warren and Drew Aller, the ball in their hands through those first 3 plays kind of shows you where things are at right now and health in the mix there for Nick Singleton. Mark, when we look at Bo Pribula, talking about getting a jolt in the run game, I was waiting in the second half there, possession by possession to see if they were going to bring in Bo, give him a chance to do something with his legs, maybe give Nick Singleton or Katron Allen a chance to do something off of Bo's presence. And yet James Franklin told us afterwards when I asked him in the post-game press conference, he said they weren't finding success with Bo out there early, and so they turned away from him. I mean, he had 1 rush for no yards in the second quarter. He also had 1 pass for 4 yards in the second quarter, and then that was it. And along the way, Katron and Nick aren't self-starters at the running back position. The offensive line isn't providing that, that separation. And that leads me to think, well, James Franklin told us right after the Wisconsin game that, quote, seams were opened up when Bo Pribula gets in the field for running backs. And so I just wonder, this was his second lowest snap count overall of the entire season, Mark, after what he accomplished in the second half at Wisconsin. I mean, you can talk about trying to do too many things at once and trying to get too many players out there, but I was surprised that there wasn't even an attempt in that second half to make Bo Pribula a factor. And, oh, by the way, everyone who covers Ohio State that I talked to last week screamed at me, this defense really struggles against mobile quarterbacks, and yet sideline was where you'd find Bo Pribula against the Buckeyes.
Yeah, that was odd when he said they didn't find success. They didn't. You had him playing what, 5 snaps in the game, right? Yeah, I mean, one pass, 1 run. I mean, you didn't find success with Venga going in motion when you took him out of being, your best interior offensive lineman. Well, that was great against Illinois. I think people have kind of figured that out. Why did you not stop doing that? I mean, you're in a game where your leading rushers are a tight end and not as mobile quarterback. I mean, and your leading receiver is a running back. I mean, this game was stood on its head. And I think at least things just weren't working, right? So why would you not try a little bit of a change of pace there in the second half? I just don't quite understand that. It's almost as if everything Bo Pribula did against Wisconsin went for naught. I mean, I don't think anybody was suggesting, I know I wasn't, I don't think either of you were, that he should come in and take over as the quarterback. And I know that they had a limited number of snaps. They didn't have a ton, but when things just weren't working, I don't get why you don't at least give it a little bit of a shot somewhere in there. And let's go back down to the goal line situation. Okay, if you're not going to give it to Warren, do you try Pribula down there with Warren, and so you have other options? I mean, the more you think about it, the more it just doesn't make much sense whatsoever. I mean, again, he established himself as a legit quarterback in my eyes against Wisconsin. And as you said, against a team that was struggling against the run and against running quarterbacks, I mean, it just doesn't make sense. And I just go back to where I think the moment was too big for Andy Kotelnicki. I mean, and again, I think he's going to be fine. I think he's going to learn from it. But I just think there are things that people like us look at that seemed to make complete sense. And we're not analysts or anything, but I think everybody was, why isn't Warren touching the ball late in the game? That's not like you don't need to have a PhD in running offenses to know that. It's your best player. And likewise with Bo Pribula. I mean, a guy can run the ball. If Aller's running for as many yards as he did, what could Pribula have done given a few more opportunities? So, yeah, I don't get any of that.
When your offense doesn't score a touchdown for the first time in a decade, you open yourself up to some questions and criticism. And that's really what we've seen take place. You got to sort through this process. What went wrong? But
yeah, we can't let the O-line off the hook either. I mean, the O-line didn't come up when it needed to. So we're like we're getting on everybody, but a lot of that would stem back or would go back to the O-line, which I think did a pretty good job in pass protection outside of a couple breakdowns, but clearly didn't do a good enough job in with the running game. So we could talk about the running backs all you want, but when your offensive line isn't getting it done, that you're going to struggle. And that's been odd for kind of this season a little bit.
And it's been on the money, though, for this Ohio State matchup.
Yeah.
Saquon Barkley, Miles Sanders, both held under 3 yards per carry in this matchup. And we thought maybe that this was a turning point and Penn State could assert itself a little bit differently in the trenches. To the Buckeyes' credit and to Penn State's detriment, that did not transpire on Saturday afternoon. Daniel, a big theme of the post-game podcast or of the post-game conversations, and I think we mentioned it on the post-game podcast too a bit, but there were like 3 or 4 veterans that publicly said they hope to get another chance to play Ohio State down the road. James Franklin, and that was brought to his attention on Monday. He said it wasn't his message in post-game, but he said he's fine with it. He's good with it. And he's glad that the guys have the anger he mentioned, but also the grit and determination to want and go face Ohio State once again. He also said the college football playoff landscape and the new college football structure sets that up to happen more than it was in the past. They're going to need some things to fall their way to get to Indianapolis. But I think, lo and behold, you could end up seeing the Buckeyes on that path if you get to the playoffs and if you continue to carve your way through it. What do you think about this? The fact that, again, these players aren't really coming in saying our season is broken. We got to get ready for a bowl game. Hopefully everybody doesn't opt out. This new structure for college football, I think we picked up on the difference immediately from the players. Instead of coming in saying, well, let's finish strong and go play in the Rose Bowl if we can, or the Peach Bowl. It's how do we get back to face the Buckeyes and compete for a national championship? 2 different players, 2 different leaders, Devontae Thomas, Kobe King, both specifically referenced national title as their goal. So again, this is a different kind of era for college football. And I think we saw a different kind of reaction to Penn State from another emotional loss to Ohio State.
Yeah, I think putting it out there that we want to see these guys again, we want another opportunity at them, I think serves as a good carrot to put out there, as opposed to, well, let's just get to the Big Ten championship game or let's just get to the playoff, and have it be a little bit more nebulous. I think it is, maybe it helps you from a focus or motivation standpoint to, put that one team and have that one, focus that energy on one thing. Like I said in the postgame pod, the amount of stuff that would have to go right to put Penn State in that scenario to see Ohio State in the Big Ten title game, you're asking a lot. At the same time, college football is a really, really weird sport, and you've seen crazier things happen. But I do think that the team did a good job of taking this loss and trying to figure out how to look forward after the game Saturday. Now, especially talking to 260er guys in Sal Wormley and Devontae Thomas, where this was their last shot at Ohio State, and you knew that it meant something to them, and you could kind of see them in real time, kind of squaring the emotions of losing a game that was this big and this important to them, with still knowing that they have a lot in front of them. Whether or not Ohio State is in front of them, we'll see. I still think that it's pretty unlikely for things to fall that way. But unlike past years, there is that possibility for things to go that way. And if you want to put that angst together and put it in one place, where you can really concentrate it and contain it, I think putting it on Ohio State and a potential rematch is good. And then if you do get there, you've got a really motivated team you've got a team that's been thinking about this for a while and, hypothetically would be ready. But I think that now their first priority is going to be avoiding that letdown and having one loss turned to 2 against Washington.
That's right. You can't focus on Ohio State in the postseason until you actually punch your ticket to the postseason. And they go 4-0 down the stretch here, and they're going to be the favorites starting this Saturday, 13-point favorite over Washington. Going to be an 8 p.m. kickoff. Going to be on Peacock, by the way, but it'll be the whiteout. And so Penn State has that, road trips to Purdue, and Minnesota then finishes up home against Maryland. They're going to be a significant favorite in each time. And if they handle their business at 11-1, I think the worst case scenario you're looking at is a first round playoff game the weekend before Christmas in Happy Valley. And I think a lot of people would take that in August as a worst case scenario. But here's the deal. Ohio State week and what follows it is so defining for James Franklin and this team right now. It's hard to ignore it, but they're going to do their best to move forward. You guys are going to help everyone move forward because you're going to go cover the basketball season opener tonight. And we got a lot of football left, but Penn State Hoops gets back to business. Mike Rhodes, year 2 with that squad. So Mark, Daniel, no, you'll do a great job on basketball season. Don't forget about football. But there'll be coverage of the opener against Binghamton up at Lions247.com tonight. We have a lot more coming out of James Franklin's press conference over at Lions247. And I don't want to shortchange all the recruiting coverage happening on the site right now between Brian Doan, Tyler Calvaruso, Alan True, and our 24/7 Sports Network. A lot of reaction to the Matt Sieg commitment, a top 24/7 defensive back from the state of Pennsylvania, but a ton of feedback from flip targets and top targets and all that. We're going to dive into more recruiting conversation on our next episode of the podcast with Tyler, but didn't want to go through this process without mentioning all the coverage over on the site. For now, stepping aside on behalf of Mark and Daniel, I'm Tyler Donahue. This has been the Lions 24/7 Podcast.